Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 2, How Our Bible Came to Us. We usually just assume that the Bible has been around, but it has a very difficult journey from the time it was written until the time that we read it now. The Old Testament is divided into three parts. There is the law, that is the Pentateuch, the prophets, and some of the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, are included as part of the prophets. And the third section is the writings. We could call these the miscellaneous books. These are the poetical books, and Daniel, and some of the others that we normally do not think in the third section. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Most of it is Hebrew, but there are some passages in Ezra and Nehemiah and in the book of Daniel that are written in Aramaic. The New Testament contains several different genres. We have the letters of Paul, which make up most of the New Testament, and then the Gospels and Acts, which are an account of what happened while Jesus was here on earth in his ministry. Then the writings of some of the apostles, John, James, and Peter. Now this was all written in Greek. So we are talking about Old Testament with Hebrew and Aramaic, New Testament with Greek. And this is not English. We do not read this readily. How did they write this material? There were several different sources for writing. The main one for the biblical material was the papyrus and the parchment. Papyrus is made from the reed, and they will split the reed into narrow strips, lay it flat, and then put another layer at right angles over it, and then pound it until it becomes like a paper. This was the easiest method to use in writing, and the papyrus was imported by the Phoenicians and distributed from Egypt. Another form of writing was the parchment. This is made from the hides of animals. Goat skin, sheep skin, are usually the forms that were used for this. For hundreds of years, this was the method that was used. A piece of papyrus or a section of parchment was joined to another section until you had a narrow, long surface on which to write. This was then rolled, and we call this a scroll. Now, a scroll, once it gets to about 40 feet, is very difficult to manipulate. You've got to do a lot of unrolling and re-rolling because of the amount of material on it. Finally, a codex was developed. This is where the pages were placed on top of one another and then fastened along the left edge. It's like our modern books. But this was not what was handled at first. At first it was all scrolls. When a scroll was copied, and they did not have printing presses then, so every copy had to be made by hand. And there were errors that crept into the text as the material was copied. These are errors of the eye and errors of the ear. Errors of the eye was what we normally call homoeoteleuton, which means ending, and they are diatography and haplography. You can see this if you have done any copying yourselves, where you are, say, working on a paper and you are looking back at the material from which you are taking the material, and your eye hits in the wrong place because it is the same as another place. Well, if you copy the same material again, that is ditography. But if you skip material because your eye goes on the same ending and you leave out material, that is called haplography. Then there's also the errors of the ear. This is especially prevalent in English because we have so many words that sound the same, but they are different in meaning. For instance, we use the term lead, and lead can be used to lead someone, but it can also be used for the metal. Well, if you are wanting one and you use a different term, you will be confused. So those are the errors of the ear, the homophone, the same sound. Just about 1947, scrolls were found near the Dead Sea. These were called the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were written about the time of Jesus or a little before, and they had been hidden in caves and were not discovered until our modern time. They sometimes give us copies of what we have in the Scripture, and sometimes they give us additional material that is not found in the Bible. And then we also have to think of Jerome. Jerome was a translator of the Old Testament and the New Testament. He was charged to make a new translation of the Bible. It was in Latin. This was called the Latin Vulgate because Vulgate means common. So it was in the language of the people. He did this in the 4th century AD. Now let's talk about a history of the English Bible. The Bible was not in English until the 13th century AD. Everything was in Latin after the time of Jerome, so from 400 AD until about 1300, we could say, everything was in Latin. John Wycliffe was one who believed that the Bible should be in the language of the people. And so what he would do would be to take the passage of Scripture used for that Sabbath and translate it into English, and then give it to his preachers, who were called lollards, and they would go out and they would preach this message to the common people. The translation of Wycliffe was published in 1384 by John Purvey. This was after the death of Wycliffe. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg didn't take place until the 15th century, 1454, 1455. There was also a new emphasis at this time on the study of Greek. The city of Constantinople was overrun by the Muslims, and the scholars who had been in Constantinople fled to the west, and with them they brought their knowledge of Greek. Erasmus was one of these, and he published his Greek New Testament in 1516. You notice that was after the invention of the printing press. This gave a new emphasis to the learning of Greek, and it began to be taught in the major universities in England. William Tyndale was another man who believed that the Scripture should be in the translation that could be used by the plowman, that anyone should be able to read it. He was opposed by the church, so he fled to Cologne in Germany and then to Worms. He published a New Testament in English in 1525. He was a prisoner for 16 months in Vilvoorde Castle in Belgium, and then executed on October the 6th of 1536. His crime, translating the Bible from Greek into English. Just before his death, he prayed that God would open the eyes of the King of England. There were many later translators and translations. Miles Coverdale in 1535 took Tyndale's Pentateuch, which was published in 1530, and Jonah, and he put them with material from the Latin Vulgate and from the German. John Rogers, just a couple of years later, published Tyndale's Genesis to Chronicles, and then the rest was from Coverdale, and this was known as the Matthew's Bible. It was dangerous to put your own name on a translation of the Scripture at this time because it was still opposed by the church. They felt that the Latin was what should be used. Then the Great Bible was published in 1539 by Thomas Cromwell, and this was Coverdale's and Matthew's Bible without notes. It's called a Great Bible because it was so big. It was put on the pulpit, chained to the pulpit, so a person couldn't steal it. And then Robert Estienne, or Robert Stephanus, divided this text into verses in his third edition of his Greek text, and this was 1551. He wanted to publish a concordance where a person could look up a particular word, and he needed to have smaller sections so that the individual could locate the word. Up to this time, there were no verse divisions at all in the Scripture. There were chapter divisions that were put in sometime earlier, but no verse divisions. The Geneva Bible, published in Geneva in 1560, known as the Breeches Bible, and this was first to use the verse division of Stephanus. It's called the Breeches Bible because in the account of the fall in the garden, they made themselves clothes, and these were called breeches. The Bishop's Bible was published in 1568, and it was a revision of the Great Bible. There were several of these that were being used in the church. We've mentioned Miles Coverdale, John Rogers, the Great Bible, Robert Estienne, and what he did with the verse division, Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible. Which one are you going to use? It's very much like what we have today in our church. We can have a dozen different translations and use them effectively. But all of these translations, which one should the church use? So an appeal was made to King James that there should be a standard translation made of all of these versions. And so King James appointed a committee made of scholars from Oxford and Cambridge. They were supposed to take the existing translation and use the best from those. They were not to make a new translation. They were not to revise the translation in any way, but use what was in existence at that time. Which means that when the King James Version was published in 1611, nobody spoke the language that was included in the Bible, except some of those people who had made their way to the United States. Of course, it wasn't the United States then, but it was the colonies. They still spoke that language. But the people in England had moved beyond this and were speaking a slightly different language. So the King James Version was published in 1611. and this was a cautious revision of the bishop's Bible. Fortunately, there had been some very good translators before this, and 9/10 of the New Testament is the work of Tyndale. Now, our modern English Bible. Since the time of the publication of the King James, many new Greek translations have been found. These are major translations. These were essential for trying to develop a Greek New Testament that was as close to the original as possible. The English Revised Version was published in 1881. This was the work of both American and English scholars, but there was an agreement made that the English translation would be first, 1881, and the American translation would not follow until 20 years later in 1901. This was the revision that was used up until about 1946. There were a few other translations that were made. I remember using one by a woman, Helen Montgomery, of the New Testament. But basically the entire Bible was either the King James or the American Standard Version. In 1946 to 1952, a new translation was made. This is called the Revised Standard Version. This made a great change in everything. This was about the time that I entered seminary, and I remember the professors discussing the RSV and should it be used. There were comments that were made that it was influenced by communists, that the translators were unfaithful to the Greek text, and these were comments that were not true. The Revised Standard Version is a good translation, but it followed a new Greek text. I mentioned that there were several new Greek translations that were found. Well, these translations were incorporated into a new Greek Testament. That is now in the 20th revision. It's constantly being revised. But this was much superior to the one single Greek text that was used in the time of the King James translators. So the Revised Standard Version began a whole new series of translations. The Amplified Bible was published in 1964, and this was an attempt to use every synonym possible for a particular verse. As you are working on a translation, you find out that there is usually one word which is proper to use in that translation. The Amplified Bible was really a dictionary set up in biblical form. They had so many different opportunities to express the word that it becomes useless. The New English Bible, which was an English translation, came out in 1961 and through 1970. This was basically English. Their vocabulary is different from American. For instance, the term for cross is gibbet. And so there are terms that appear in the New English Bible that Americans would not recognize. The New American Bible was a Catholic version published in 1970, a very good translation. Then the Living Bible came out in 1971. This is the work of a single individual who had taken the New American Standard Version of 1901 and had put it into simpler language so that his children could understand it. Some of the neighbors learned about this, and they wanted copies of it, and they finally convinced him to publish it. So this is what he did then in 1971 as the Living Bible. The New American Standard Bible is a revision of the 1901 text, and it is a very good translation. Today's English version appeared in 1976, and again, it is an English translation. The New International Version was published in 1978. This is a version that I worked on for over 10 years. This was an attempt to put into American English what conservatives felt was the emphasis in the text. There were lay people in the church who appealed to their elders to make a translation that they could use that was conservative in approach. The Evangelical Theological Society took this up and appealed to those who were members who could handle the Greek and the Hebrew to volunteer to do a preliminary translation of a book. And so I, along with Dr. Howard Irvin from Oral Roberts University, volunteered to do Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. I ended up working 10 years on that translation. The New King James Version was a revision of the King James Version, and that came out in 1982. The New Jerusalem Bible is again a Catholic version, done in French first of all, and it was published in 1985. And then the New Century Version, the International Children's Bible, and the Everyday Bible were published in 1986 and 1988. This was a fourth grade level. They wanted something that could be used by children. The Revised English Version came out in 1989, and again it is an English version. And then the New Revised Standard Version was in 1990. The New International Reader's Version was published in 1996, and this was at a third grade level. There were two committees that were working on this, and what we did was to take the New International Version and reduce it to a third grade level. The Holy Bible New Living Translation was done in 1996, and then it was revised again in 2004 and 2007. The Holy Bible, the English Standard Version, was published in 2001. The Holy Bible, today's New International Version, was published in 2001 and revised in 2005. This is one that uses language that is inclusive. They wanted to not only use men, but men and women. The Common English Bible was published in 2010. Now, there have been other translations since then, but this is the main group of translations. And in the book by Fee and Strauss, How to Choose a Translation for All It's Worth, the one that they recommend is the New International Version. They give a chart of all of the versions. Those that are on the left, which are conservative translations, the King James Version, Revised Standard Version, the New King James Version, the English Standard Version, those are all on the left. In the middle are the mediating translations, New International Version, the New American Bible, New Jerusalem Bible, the New English Bible, On the right are functional equivalent, or what we would call paraphrases. This makes up the Good News Bible, the Living Bible, and the Message, which is one of the most recent Bibles. So there are many, many versions of the Bible. And as you go into a bookstore and you want to choose a translation for yourself, what is the question that you ask? What do I want to use it for? Is it for study? Is it for reading, for pleasure? How am I going to use it? You don't ask what is the best translation, because there are different translations for different purposes. So you want one that will serve you the best. I would recommend that you pick 3 or 4 translations from different categories, and you can compare them one with another, and you will not be far off in the best translation. So that is the history of the English Bible.